I will be putting my dust mask on. I don't turn in my shop without it. I don't sand without it. So I will be putting that on. Hopefully that works. But to start with, we're going to do some mushrooms today. And I'll pass these around. Everyone knows what a mushroom looks like. That's usually true until you hand them a piece of paper and a pen and ask them to draw one or to turn one. But we found that the mushrooms are a nice, easy project. We use them with the kids at West High School when they finish some of their other projects. I really enjoy the mushrooms because it's a quick, easy project. And I think maybe many of you walk out to your shop some days and you're ready to tackle the project that you've been working for 6 months on. Other days you walk out to the shop and the last thing you want to do is worry about something that you've got 6 months invested in already. And so it's nice to have a project that you can just throw onto the lathe. So we're going to talk about how you turn these. Most of these we're talking about using wood that came from trees that came down, branches. It's not big chunks of wood, it can be small chunks of wood. It's happened to be some cherry that came down earlier this year in a storm. Threw it on the burn pile and then rescued it off the burn pile when I figured I was going to do some mushrooms. It works great. The key thing to understand here is that with branch wood, the grain is running with the axis. We're turning between centers. We're going to start out here. Turning between centers is one of the safest ways you can go. When you add to that a safety drive, which is what I use in my shop, we use at school, it's almost impossible to get that wood to come off of this lathe. Because if I get a catch, it's going to spin on the lathe, but with the safety drive, it just keeps spinning. It doesn't come off the lathe. So I'm going to show you several different ways of doing this. We're going to start between centers. And the first one, I just need to create a tenon. This is going to be a base later when I get done with a couple of the other pieces. So a lot of ways that you can create tenons. Is that still okay? I've gotten to the point now where I turn tenons with a skew. It's uneven at this point, so I'm just evening out the end. Now, before you can cut a tenon, you have to know what the size of the chuck is that you're going to be using. So you need to check that, know what your target is. The key with this, I'm using a skew. This happens to be one of the skews that Alan Lacer sells. It's a skew that has the curved edge. I really recommend that. Your working area has increased to at least half of the blade, where normally you'd be working down on a third of the blade if we were using this to level the surface out. In this case, what I'm going to do is my first cut, I'm just going to take a guess. It's a 1/16 of an inch or so wide. If I mess up the guess, if it's too small, I've lost a 1/16 of an inch. That's a little smaller than I want, so I'll make this one a little bit larger. I'm not touching the wood, I'm just bringing the gauge up close. And we'll take a little bit more so that we have a little bit deeper tenon. The key with a tenon, and this I think is maybe one of the most important things I'll say for anyone turning, kids at school, you in your shop, if you don't get the piece onto the lathe tight, which means right down here, this has to be square. This has to be flat. If you put this on and it rocks, it's not flat. And if you don't have that, you can't do a decent job turning because you're not going to be holding the piece on the way that we need to. So that tenon is absolutely critical that we get that down. Now in this case, the only other issue that I have is I need to make sure that it will fit into my chuck. A lot of people use different things. Calipers are my favorite. Caliper has 3 measurements. The measurement here is the exact measurement here, so you can measure inside, outside, and it's the exact depth. So for the caliper, we need to make sure that we don't bottom out in the chuck. I can use that back depth to determine that that's going to be a bit of a problem, because that piece right there exceeds the depth of the chuck. That would hit the bottom. It would keep the top edge, which is the critical edge, away from what we are trying to accomplish of getting that nice and tight. So I'm just going to take a bit of that off. And actually I can take this down, because the other thing with almost every chuck is you have a center hole that the little nub that is on the tailstock can drop into. So with that, we're good for the subsequent step. So now the first one we're going to do is we're going to turn between centers. So you mark your centers, and usually I'll use a divider to kind of find out where a center is. Now keep in mind, when it's a branch like this, you've got the pith running through it. And anytime you have the pith in the wood, it's most likely going to crack as it dries. It's very hard to get it to dry without, if there's any amount of wood that you're leaving in the piece, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So in this case, we have the option of, do we put the cap up here of the mushroom and the tail here, or switch it around? Ideally, if we can, it really makes sense to have the cap up here so that we can hollow under the cap from this direction. You've got less obstruction here than you have on the headstock side. So if you can do it that way, that's how we're going to do it. Turn the piece before you turn it on, especially when you're using out of round pieces or bark on it like this. And so at this point, I want to be as close as I can, turn it away from you, or use the wheel to turn it so that you're not catching your thumb. Okay, at this point, my favorite tool for any of this is the bowl gouge. You can see this piece isn't flat or isn't square to the lathe. Generally, I'll turn it on. I'm not standing directly in front of it. We're going to get some speed here going. I want to flatten the bottom. This is going to be the base. So I just want it flat across. Okay, this is going to be the cap up here. I'm using the bowl gouge. I'm starting my cuts with the flute almost straight up and down, and then I'll open it as I need to get into the cut. I'm making the cut the same way we teach the kids to turn eggs. I'm positioning my left foot so that I finish the cut balanced here. I'm balanced here. I start out unbalanced here. You have to come into the end of the cut balanced. Should have had that tight. Now what you have to think about here is that the safety drive, or any drive that you use, is going to have a center point that comes out usually 1/8 of an inch, maybe 1/4 of an inch. The problem is that when that point goes in, it not only splits the wood, it compresses the wood. So the point that you're going to have to deal with is much deeper than what you'd expect. So at this point now we have to at least start deciding what kind of mushroom, what shape we're looking for here. And I do recommend, turn the lathe off frequently just to see what you have. You might find that there's a knot, there's some interesting grain or something that you don't want to cut away. At this point, it really doesn't matter. So we're just looking for creating the bell of that mushroom. And it doesn't matter if the piece of wood is even, and in fact, a lot of times if it's uneven, it can work to your advantage. So in this case, I'm going for a little more of kind of the bell-shaped curve for the mushroom. The more control I can get in that full cut, the better. Now, the rest is kind of fooling my eyes a little bit. I don't know if I want to make one that has bark on the bottom yet, so what I'll do is I'll preserve some of that. We're just going to come in. We're going to start creating a shape here. Now realize that as soon as you start taking wood away here, you now start limiting yourself on what you can do for this edge. And so we're coming down, I'm taking a lot of bark off. If the bark falls off, as far as I'm concerned, that's fine. It was meant to be. Bark will eventually come off even if you glue it on. You're very persistent with CA glue. It will eventually come off. So I figure if nature wants it off, we'll let it come off. Okay, so key is using that bevel. When we say finding the bevel, we're using the bevel to orient us to the work. We're not pressing. All of my force, there's one vector and only one on my left hand. That's going straight down on the rest. There's no pressure on the wood. What I want is that cutting edge just to kiss that wood ever so lightly. And with that, I can make that cut. So we're coming down here. Now, from the pictures that I sent around, you can have stems that are very wide. You can have stems that are very thin. That's probably a good time to check and see kind of where we're at. Looking at kind of the relationship of the height of the top relative to the height of the bottom. I don't think, you don't want to get it down to half and half. We're still kind of a little bit more on the top than I'd like maybe. We'll take care of that in a minute. So at this point, I have to decide now what I'm going to do with this bottom edge. And so I'm going to come in. Again, I'm going to find that bevel. I'm going to start putting that edge in just a little bit because I want it to be at least hidden. And now I need to also make that decision on the bottom. I'm not sure in this case if I really like the bark on the bottom here. And so, pardon? You okay? Okay. That's okay. While you're playing with that, I'll play with this. So I think in this case, I'm going to take the bark off. And in this case, I'm going to start thinking about if I'm not going to have the bark sharp on the bottom, then we're going to create some kind of a bulb down here. Now I'm starting to look at what thickness I want that stem to be. So now the second cut that we teach the kids is a shear scrape. So I'm just checking to see how this is looking. This is a nice clean cut, but there are some ridges there. I can clean that up using a shear scrape. I am going to define that top just a little bit more so that my eyes know where it's going. And in fact, I'm going to shorten it a little bit to make sure that when I finish, I don't end up popping up into that area where the compressed wood is. So a shear scrape is going to function best if I have an angle here. If I level this out, I'm going to rip the grain up as soon as I get it to a steep angle. Now, this is such a light touch. Generally, 2 fingers here. I get it into my body. The control is entirely with my body moving. My arms are not controlling this. Doesn't matter if I'm left or right-handed because the body is what's actually controlling. As I sweep up here, now I have to be careful because if I catch that bark with a shear scrape, it's coming off. And so there, I'll clean this edge up, taking a real nice slow cut. And if I want to keep the bark on, I'll definitely come in and sand some of those lines out. Okay, shear scrape down here works well, but we can only work from the top, the widest section. I can sweep down this way. But to go the other direction, I have to switch the tool to the other side. You need to get good at using tools on your left and your right side. Again, doesn't matter if you're left or right-handed because the hands aren't doing anything other than holding the tool to the rest. The body is what's making the movements. So at this point, we'll do one more thing. At this point, we're just going to clean up this bottom a little bit more. And I'll undercut that just a little bit so that it sits better. Okay, at this point with some sanding, basically you have this mushroom. So I'll send, if you want to hand that to them. What we're going to go for is this mushroom and send them together. If you look at the first one, it's a mushroom. If you put that in front of 10 people, 9 of them at least will guess that it's a mushroom. The problem is the 10th one is probably on mushrooms or something, and so may have trouble comprehending what it is. But if you look at it, because it's a branch, and if you're using anything but absolutely dry wood, that is going to crack eventually. You're going to have a crack that goes right through the bell and through the base. It's inevitable. Eventually it will happen. To help that, I usually put finish on right away. You can slow that process down, but it is ultimately going to happen. Now the second one, I like to push to the point where if you eliminate the weight in the top, you do two things. One, you can begin to tip the mushroom, because mushrooms, from the pictures, very few mushrooms stand straight up. They tend to tip, move one way or the other. If you get rid of the weight in the top, you can tip it. The other thing is that you can avoid usually the cracking in the top if you can thin that down. And so now we're going to thin that down. We're going to use, as long as I can be cutting, I would cut. Cutting is far preferable in my mind to scraping. This is a little bit big for doing some of the cutting, but if we go to a little bit smaller bowl gouge, I should be able to come in. Key here is I've got to get the bevel rubbing, support it with that left hand, and I can now cut in. Now, this is a wide bottom. That limits my access. And so I'm only going to be able to cut so far, but I can make that cut. I can come in, and this is where I would provide some caution. You need to know now for the cut I'm going to make what you're doing. Because if I come in at the wrong angle and I dig into this surface, I have the potential for one of the biggest catches you can get. If this tool is open so that the flute is toward the ceiling at all, we're going to lose half of that cap and it's going to get real exciting. And so you don't want to do that, but by keeping this rolled over, I can take a fairly, and right there you're on the edge with that cut. But I would rather do a little of that at risk than scrape the entire thing. But I'm right there on that edge. and it gets worse the further you go in. So we're going to switch tools to something that's much safer. At this point, we're going to use the my favorite tool. I use a bunch of them. You can see them. They're the Allen wrenches. You can cut them off straight. You can angle them. And I'll show you a couple of places where the angle works well for those. The only negative with these is that they take a fair amount of sharpening. They aren't going to stay sharp a long time. And some people will, make the argument for the easy tools. They make other arguments, and they all work. But in this case, I'm going to come in. I'm angling the tool down. And the key again is I'm using my body, so I'm controlling the amount of cut that we're getting here. Now as we get down to the bottom, I have to roll it the other way. If I come in and I hit the stem with this edge up, it's going to torque it down. So I have to be moving the tool back and forth. Now, how far in you go is entirely up to you. The other thing you'll want to keep an eye on is as we begin to undercut, you can see the rim here, and you can see we're into the bark here. Because it was uneven thickness, that actually works very nicely in a finished mushroom because it produces a cap that isn't flat across. It has some movement, but you have to be careful because you're now creating a very thin line of bark here. The bark may come off. Ideally, I want to come far enough out so that I eliminate this flat wood here on this side. And you want to do this work on this edge. You want to get this finished early in the process and then leave it alone. Don't touch it again. I don't know if we're flat yet or if we've gotten down. Okay, almost there. We've got one little section there. This isn't the cleanest cut, and I'm kind of pushing things a little bit for time. Normally in my shop I would be spending a little more time. I'd be sharpening this tool already, and I can go to another tool in a second rather than worrying about sharpening. The sharpening is very easily done on a grinder. We're down to an 1/8 of or 1/16 of an inch there, so we just have to pull this around. Then I try to maintain that thickness. Now when you're looking at this from my angle, I can see exactly what the thickness is because I can see the tool and I can see the outside of the bell. Now I have to be using this at center and pointed down. I don't want to have this pointed up at all. Now we're reaching the limits of what this tool can do. You're starting to hear some chatter. If we get, with this diameter of hex tool, if we get out more than about an inch, inch and a quarter off of the tool rest, what we have is a very efficient chatter tool. And you can hear it. You can still use it, but you have to realize that you're going to be chunking out some wood. Now one of the problems I have then is as I start rounding the inside of that bell, I start running into where I'm going to run into the edge of the base here. So that's where having the same tool with a little bit of bend to it works well. And in this case, I have to be a little careful. I've got a lot of torque out there and I don't want to hit the other side, the stem. So that could get exciting again. But all of a sudden you can see and you can hear the squeaking has gone away, which means that the tool is not vibrating. It's doing what I want, and it's because it's twice the thickness. So you need to have Allen wrenches that are sharpened to different size Allen wrenches to get in. So that works well. I'll do this just because it's fun. The Ellsworth tool for hollowing. If you want to be really comfortable, feel comfortable with what we're doing, I need to drop the rest a little bit. So we turn the lathe off, drop the rest. If you want to have an enjoyable, comfortable time, get something that's 4 foot long and half an inch or more thick. Now, we're to the point where we do need to at least be concerned about where the top is. It's the same thing. This is a mini bowl, essentially. We just need to know where that top is. Don't need to be overly accurate, but we're not as far as I thought we might be. Now, I might not be able to move around the corner of this real well, so I may have to go back to the other tool. But I can take this in a little bit deeper. And all we're doing is lightening it up and avoiding it tipping over. So at this point, I'll go back to, I'll use this one. It is a nice angle. Okay, if I were at home and doing this, sure. If I were at home doing this, this is the point where now, actually I just have to smooth that little ridge that I have in there. I would be starting to sand, and the nice thing about doing demos is I don't have to sand. So we're going to take this off. You're going to imagine that I've sanded this all nice and smooth. And so to take this off, there are 2 things that we have to think about now. The top we need to make sure is low enough that it's not going to have the point involved in it. The bottom we need to make sure is a little bit concave, although that doesn't really matter. So I'm using thin parting tool. Come back, make it a little wider so that it doesn't bind. Now come in with a nice cleaning cut. Make sure your thinnest cut is not right next to the bottom, because that will twist piece out. If there's wood in the way, get rid of that. On the top, I like to bring that down because I'm kind of lazy. I don't like to sand a lot on the top. And if you have the thin parting tool sharpened the right way, that means that the bevel is down here. That's a straight edge. There's no secondary bevel here. As soon as you start putting the secondary bevel on this tool, you end up losing the ability of getting into a nice tight space. To use this tool, though, I have to bring it in. I have to find the bevel up on top where I'm not cutting, and then I move it in and I cut at that orientation down by raising the handle and sliding it in. If you're using the tool correctly and you're sharpening by putting this on a stone and rubbing this, these edges are sharp. When you're sharpening the bottom, you don't get that. With these edges sharp, I can contour the top here right into the curve I want. I'm using mostly the side, a little bit of the tip, taking that in. And I can shave that down. If I think I'm getting too close to that tip, I can make that a little more blunt. Now this is cherry, so it really has a fair amount of strength. And this is kind of demonstrating the fact that we're between centers. So the force, all of the forces, are right on those two pins. Okay. So at home I would take a knife, which I don't have with me, cut those pegs off, and you've got basically that mushroom, Mike. Okay, so that's the first orientation. Now, a lot of people will, a lot of people feel a little bit nervous with that floating out in the center. Now, what I will say is that you can do a large bell. In fact, I'll send this picture around for you to see. This is a picture of this mushroom, the maple, spalted maple. I'll send these pictures around. That was done totally in the middle, just like I turned this piece, just between centers. And you can see how that was oriented. But what we're going to do now is we're going to turn a mushroom where I think people might be a little more comfortable. I've put a tenon on that. We're going to lock that into the chuck. Key again is that square tenon. And when you first set the piece, especially with the Nova chuck, it has the little V-groove right at the top. You need to either create that with a skew or make sure that you're getting that embedded very firmly. Now, because we had created the tenon between centers, I have a mark on the top. So as long as I have that mark and I'm not going to hurt it anymore, may as well bring the tailstock up because it just provides that much more support. Right now that piece cannot go anywhere. It is locked in there. Now in this case, we're going to put the cap on this side, on the tailstock side. And I'm assuming it's okay to keep going. Okay. So one comment I would make, when you're doing turnings like this with the bark, it is really hard on the tools. The edges are not going to stay sharp very long. So I've brought extra tools because I don't have the capability of sharpening. But as long as I'm going to be cutting bark first here, I'm going to rough that off here. So I'm looking for the cap. Again, I'm finding my position. My right leg is going to be positioned about here. I've got the tool in my side. The entire cut is coming from my body. And I know the top's going to have to go down low enough to at least get rid of the mark that's there. So we'll come down to about there. Now, let's just check to see what kind of grain, what's happening. So I knew we had a branch, a dead branch there. That'll give a little figure in the top of the cap. We need to decide what kind of cap we're going to do. In this case, we may do just a little bit different. And no, I think we're gonna stay with the same general shape. It will help the in the hollowing part. I'm gonna create kind of that sigmoid curve. This is my body controlling the cut. So if that's the bell, now it's better at that point to actually switch tools so that I can be coming square into the wood. Less chance of it skating. I can take big cuts. I can take little cuts. It doesn't matter. Whatever you're comfortable with, as long as you're using the bevel to orient to the wood. And in this case, we're going to come in. Now, a base this wide with that head is not going to look particularly good. So again, I'm going to get rid of the bark. I could be leaving that. But there's another reason I'm doing that as well. Makes the hollowing easier if I don't have a large width right there. So I don't want to take all of the weight out of the stem yet, because the stem's going to support us while we're hollowing this top part. Now I've got good access. I can make another cut or two. However, that cut's going to be safer now if I get my tool rest in supporting the cut. Oh, thank you. Yeah, that'll help. Also help you see it. And I'm going to have a little bit more angle so I can get to the stem there. Now there are limits as to how far I can go, but if I roll the tool over, I can go work down the stem, which I'm going to want to have thinner anyway. And now I can get back to that same cut. I can take that out here and be in danger of getting that catch because I'm right on the edge, or we revert back to some of our other hollowing tools. I'm going to need to raise the rest a little bit. Now I can get closer because an extra 1/4 of an inch makes a difference when I'm back to a thin tool. Now the first thing I want to do is better define this edge. So I'm going to come in. We're going to just start working that down. I get the tool into my body. It's best if we're moving it back and forth in small increments. We can control how much wood it's taking using the body. How are we doing time-wise? Okay. So, what we can also do is, in this case, I have the tool sharpened opposite. So, The other tool I've used, it goes left. This goes right. So this is designed perfectly. Now, oops, you got to watch the chuck. And just a side comment, you do not really want to be using a chuck with those jaws out, because this is where that could get really nasty. If those jaws are out and you happen to hit it with either your hand or your tool. But now with this cut this direction, I can come in, and where I couldn't get to that side wall because I was starting to run into the chuck, I can come in, and this works great on this side. But we can also go back to this, and I do need to lower that because this is a bigger bar. Doesn't have to be quite as close. So this gives you a lot of safety, a lot of security. There's nowhere that this can go. I might shatter the piece if I got a strong enough catch, but it's staying on the lathe unless it's in pieces. Now generally I like a nice continuous curve going up the stem. Now there I need to make sure that I roll this over, angle it to pick that wood up on the right hand side so that I'm not coming into that with it raised. This might be where I come back in now with this tool and just smooth that couple of those ridges. You can hear the squeaking. That's telling me that I'm on the verge of where this tool is usable, because I'm a good 1.5 to 2 inches out over the end of the tool rest. So I know those cuts are not going to be nice clean cuts. They're going to look kind of like chatter cuts. Now to kind of finish a couple of things that we need to do, we're going to turn the lathe off. We're going to pull the tailstock out now because we don't need that any longer for support. One of the benefits of doing the mushroom with the base in the chuck is it takes one of the two spots that I need to clean up off of the table, because now I can clean the top of the bell off as long as I've gone down far enough to get rid of that little dimple from the drive. So now I would pull the tool rest out. I would sand the top and get that completely done before I continue messing with the inside. Because if something moves, you're never going to get it back to perfectly round in the chuck again. Okay, so now I have to decide what we're doing on the bottom, but I just want to clean that stem up because I think we don't have a very pleasing curve or shape. Now with the wood behind, and I just hit a knot there. It's an old dead branch that was in there. So I kind of anticipated that. Now I'm going to just blend that in. This you have to be very careful because we've got that flute toward the ceiling, which is the danger zone. But that smoothed that out fairly decently. I need to figure out what we're doing on the base. You want to keep that wood out of the way. You want, again, some kind of a nice pleasing curve or shape to that. The more weight you put in the base, the more you can tip it. Now there are two ways of tipping these. There are actually three ways to get that tip. The easiest is when I get all done with this, I just take it to the belt sander or the disc sander, and you just sand the bottom at an angle. That's exactly what I did with the first one that I sent around. I created the angle, and that one I purposely pushed. I kind of like having them right on the verge of tipping over. It makes people nervous. Because if you set it down on a table that isn't perfectly flat, you set it one direction, it'll tip over, the other direction it won't. So now I would be sanding all of this, slow the lathe down, pull the tool rest out, sand all of that. I would sand this bottom edge, smoothing that, rounding it. I can do that. I can also get some curvature there, just using the edge of this tool so that I finish that round. Generally, I'd slow that down a little bit. And so now if you're going to take it to the disc sander, take that off, it really doesn't, you don't have to undercut this. You just cut this flat. And so there's that one, if you want to pass that around. It's not perfectly smooth, but smooth enough. Okay. Yes. Yep. The flute angle on the stem as I was coming down the stem, can you see that from overhead? Or we're just from the side? Okay, let me go this way then. As we're coming down that stem, I start out with the flute almost up and down, but keeping the flute on, I can bring that flute to where it's pointed toward the ceiling. And I'm using this edge here, but using that bevel. Now, if you just stuck the tool in and you tried to find that, chances are really good that it's going to dig and you're going to get a catch. The only way you can do that is you have to start back here. You have to move into that, knowing where that bevel is and knowing where you're cutting on that edge, so that as you slide around and you bring this more upright, you know that you have the support on the area that you're cutting with the bevel under it. But that's why I'm saying you're right on the verge. You're going to get the cleanest cut right on the verge of a nasty catch. That's just the... Yeah, if I had rolled it too far, I would get a catch. It would dig into the wood and it would come back, or it would take the top off. Which angle? Yeah, the more angle you can maintain, the safer it is. Yeah, but you have to be cutting, and so the key is that you're just off of that edge, and the way you stay off of that, you're just you're cutting with the bevel of the tool in the orientation that I'm not sure how I can show you. The key is if I'm in the position here where a bevel is rubbing, I can be cutting with that edge and create no problems other than a just beautiful clean cut. But if I bobble, you can't do that with your arms. If you don't have the control of the tool with your body so that your whole body is controlling where that angle is and how close you are to that edge of failure. Without your body controlling that, there's no way you can make that work. Yep, you get a little bit of a bobble and it's going to catch. Or stop cutting. One of the two. Okay, so third, how we doing time-wise? When do you want me to stop? Pardon? Okay. So I'm going to send another picture around. Some of the pieces that I have up here, well, I can send both of these around too. Some of the pieces that I have something on top, bark, have some kind of feature here that I wanted to protect. So the trick on doing something like this is you've got to get a tenon on the base. Problem is, how do you get a tenon on without destroying that top? If I had dug in far enough to use the point tool between centers, I would have lost most of this detail. So how do you do that? Well, the answer is fairly simple. And again, there may be some people that cringe a little bit here. But with a 4-jaw chuck, there are two options. One, you can take 2 of the jaws off. If this is what I wanted to preserve, and this is exactly what I did with this piece at home, I wanted to preserve this bark. I didn't want to have a hole in the top here, so I have to remove that. So what I did was, my jaws opened a little bit further. If you open the jaws, or you take 2 of the opposing jaws off, you can bring that piece in, bring your tailstock up, trap that, and you have all the strength you need to be able to turn a tenon. And all we're doing is very carefully cutting a tenon here. So at this point, that will hold the piece. These jaws wouldn't work. I'd have to use the larger jaws so that they open up a little bit. What happens is this nests in, and those 4 jaws are they're going to contact the wood out here and out here. And I don't care, because that's all going to disappear as part of the dome. All I want is the very top. I don't want a hole in the top. So that's basically how I created this. And there are I think there are some pictures that kind of illustrate that. I'll send those around. But I'll show you then what we're going to do is, this is a 2-piece mushroom. Now a lot of times you'll have a piece of wood that just isn't thick enough from top to bottom, or tall enough from top to bottom, to be able to do a stem and have it sit far enough off the table. And so in this case, I'm just using a much smaller piece of wood. All I want to do is I want to create a cap for the mushroom. So once again, I'm going to make sure that that's nice and tight. Now, in this case, I won't bring the tailstock up, because if I did, I'd destroy what I worked hard to be able to get here. And so now I'm going to move the tailstock out of the way. And basically, what we have now is the bottom of a bowl that we're going to be turning. And we'll switch tools to something sharper. Turn the speed of the lathe down. Anytime you put a new piece of wood on, stand out of the way, turn it on, make sure everything's clear, turning well. Okay, and so at this point, make sure we're tight. Now, if I had come from the side, I'd have a much rougher ride. If I just hold the bevel because it's not round. And if I work just from the side, straightening that out, I'll beat myself up. Coming from the top, as soon as I create a place for that bevel to follow, it's a piece of cake. There's no vibration. It's nice and easy. Want to keep the rest close enough so that I don't have room for fingers to fall in. I have a crack here that's kind of defining. I knew that went into the wood a bit. So what I don't know is how much of this very top I'm going to be able to keep, and that may dictate what kind of shape. Now, one of the things I like about the mushrooms are that because they can be done quickly, there's no consequence whatsoever. If this branch ends up going back into the burn pile in pieces, I've learned something and nothing's been lost. So now, need to stop, kind of figure out what we have, because we've got some nice heartwood, some sapwood here. I still have the crack, but I also want to preserve some of this bark on top. So how do I deal with that? Well, I was thinking I was going to do a rounded cap, but with the crack there, I'm not sure I really like the crack there, so I can begin to adjust the shape of this. And let's see if the crack's disappearing, getting worse, getting better. It's still there, so I'm probably going to have to live with that crack, otherwise I take the whole dome of the mushroom off. So we're just going to come in. We're just going to even that out. Find a nice curve. Get my body back into the tool. Oh, never pull the tool back on the wood. Take the tool off the wood before you pull back. Okay, I need to find a shape. Now I'm probably going to, with shear scraping, take a little more of that bark off than I really want. But I can, if I get a nice steep enough angle, I can shear scrape that. And I can shear scrape this bottom edge if I want to roll that in. A lot of mushrooms have the lower part of the cap come in. Okay, I'd be sanding. If that's where I want to be, there's a little more ridge there than I want necessarily, but I want to just get to the base then, the second part. But now what we would need to do is we would need to jam chuck this. And that's one thing I don't have the capability of doing tonight in any pretty way. However, just to show you what we'd be doing, if I had another piece of wood, I could easily create a jam chuck there, just a shape of wood that would fit that. In this case, we're going to accept the fact that we're going to mess the top up a little bit. And just to show you the process, at this point, I would center that. I'm going to get some marks on there, but I'm pressing that wood in to hold it. We'll turn the speed down so no one has to worry about catching it. Everything's clear now. That's not turning true. Now, that could be done purposely or not. That's not really what I was trying to do. But if I wanted, we talked about other ways of tipping a mushroom. If I were to turn this, I could hollow this out, leave a peg. That peg would be at an angle when you put that in a stem, the cap of the mushroom. And so You'll see that on a couple of the mushrooms, and in fact, this one, pass around, is exactly, well, in this case, the top of the stem is angled, but I can do the exact same thing by how I create the little tenon that we're going to center on. But we're going to try to do a little bit better than that, so we're going to just bring this back so it's a little bit straighter. It's still not straight. Yeah, we're going to go with that. Okay, so now we're between centers. We're going to make sure it's turning reasonably well. And I'm going to be a little gentler here because I'm just resting that top in. Now if we're jam chucked in, I could be a little tighter because I wouldn't be damaging that wood. Right now I know that the top of this chuck is going to be cutting into the top of the mushroom. Now we're going to come in and, like I said, I cut anytime I can over scraping. And with the bottom of the mushroom exposed like this, it makes it much easier to be able to get in and cut this. Now it's a rough cut initially because it's not perpendicular. Okay. Now I can also do the pull cut. But very carefully, and all I'm trying to do right now is to level that out. It'll make the next cut easier. Now, if any of my students at school ever attempted to do a bowl with that cut, I'd be taking them off at the knees because that's not a beginner's cut at all. That cut can get you in trouble. On all of the bowls that we're doing at school, the cut starts here, comes through here, and it goes from the outside in, just like I'm doing here. So there are times that it's do as I say, not as I do. And I give you the same warning that if you're not comfortable with your cut, then be very cautious with that cut that I was just doing. So now the idea here is we just want to take this down, create a tenon here. So I can start angling this down. I need a bit of wood that's straight that I can create then a hole for it to go into the stem. You need some wood to be able to glue. Now I can also come back in and I can scrape. We'll use this one. Need a little more speed. It's quicker, easier. Now, this is kind of like a calabash bowl where that inside lip comes in. Okay, once again, imagine I've sanded that. It all looks pretty. It's smooth. How much sanding you do on the inside is up to you. Now, I did take a couple of chips there, so before we leave that all together, we're just going to come back, clean those up. Because those would be very noticeable. And a very light shear scrape on that inside edge. All we're trying to do is round that a little bit. I don't know if we took those out. Pretty much a little sanding. You can see that we haven't gotten down to the lower side yet, but that's fine. Okay, we're going to leave that. So now to take that off, if I've got a little bit of a dowel, a little bit of a tenon down there, all I'm going to do is I'm going to sneak up on that above it. So first of all, I'm going to make sure that that's pretty flat and that the base is pretty flat. And we're a little bit low with the tool rest. It was wanting to get a little grabby and catchy. We'll have a little more angle down now, which is the more appropriate direction. And then you know the game chicken. How close can you go? Okay. So you're going to ignore the marks on the top, because if we had jam chucked that correctly, we wouldn't have those marks. We would have that flat, but that's the top. And if you have another 5 minutes, we'll have a base to go with it. There it is. Okay. Let's go to see. Pardon? Yeah, that's a problem that we have at school too. That the tightening and loosening go in opposite directions. Again, we want a really nice tight grip initially. And it's really important, if you're not finishing it, if it's going to come off of the chuck and go back on, you'd mark where the jaws are, and you really work to get them tight, and the edge of the chuck. Okay. So we'll put that up for safety, because this one's going to go fast. So this is my base. So this is going to be my stem up here. Now you have to kind of decide what shape you want your stem. Now a lot of times on the base I like a little bit of the bark left down there, so we'll leave a little of that. And here I'm going for a nice continuous curve all the way down. So we're going to take the big wood out. Now we're going to come back with a cleaning cut. So we're going to be focusing on good control, just using the edge of that, using the body to control that curve. So normally what I would be doing is I'd have the cap of the mushroom. I'd be stopping, At this point, we don't need the tail rest anymore. I just had that in for support. I'd be using this with the cap, and you can bring the cap right on down. We just drill a hole here, or you can turn one out of the wood. This is angled. This would produce the same result as the one I passed around. The cap would fit on there a little bit crooked. I can create the same thing by when I take this off, cut the tenon off, I can sand that at an angle. So actually that could be at an angle, the cap could be sitting at that angle, and you're going to create some real movement in the mushroom, and that's what makes mushrooms really interesting. So at this point you'd sand that up after the hole was drilled, and there it is. And then you take the bandsaw, or, well, I wouldn't suggest the bandsaw. Actually, what I do on these is I leave enough of a tenon that I'll pull this out. It's a little bit of laziness, but I mean, at this point, I can take my thin parting tool, and it doesn't matter if it's turning perfectly round or not. And come in. Because I really don't like sanding that much wood off, because it creates a huge amount of dust. Now I can't really see, my light's not in the right position necessarily, so we'll turn this down a little bit. There, I've got it. So I'm rushing this a little bit. Normally I don't work quite this fast in the shop. But at this point, then that would have a hole in. The cap drops in to that. A trick that I use then, okay, tied up here with glasses. Trick that I use is I will put finish on both the base and the top before I put them together. I don't glue them. And so what that does is it allows me to let the finish dry. I use the Watco or the tried and true. Let that dry, and then you can take it to the buffing wheel, and you can buff the entire stem. You can buff the entire cap and some of the under cap if you want to. And so if you look at some of these, some of those are buffed pretty well, and then just bring them back together and glue them. And so it gives you access to finishing those off. So I have to say it's one of the most artistic things I do, actually, because every piece you get to play with. There's little risk. You're not throwing an expensive piece of wood away. In fact, some of these are the ugliest piece of wood that you can find in the burn pile. Do things like this, cut across branches. If you look at this one, this is created by doing the dome of the mushroom on a branch. And so that's the only way you can get part of the mushroom sticking out that far. You have to have part of the wood out that far. And a branch does that nicely. It makes it tough turning because you're turning into the end grain. It can be pretty wonky. As you're turning it, you have to turn slow, take light cuts. But you can create those kinds of shapes by going in and finding spots. you know, at this point, there's enough here that when I bring that cap down, it's going to come down on this side. So, okay, that's what I have to tell you on mushrooms.